Today is the 77th anniversary of VE Day, when Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Allies. Because of the pandemic, this is the first time since 2019 that full-scale celebrations have been able to take place across the country. There have been wreath-laying ceremonies, Thanksgiving services and street parties in the UK today. So to discuss the meaning of VE Day 77 years on, I'm joined by the historian David Oldroyd-Bolt. David, thank you for joining me.
Andrew, thanks so much.
So, obviously, during the pandemic, there could be no celebration. That was the 75th anniversary, of course, a couple of years ago, but now we have the opportunity to do so. Is this still important?
I think it's hugely important to remember. It's probably, for most Britons, the defining aspect of the 20th century, that we stood alone between the fall of France and Operation Barbarossa, where Germany invaded Russia, and then carried on throughout the war with the Americans and then the Russians to defeat Nazism. I think one of the aspects of it we should remember is that although it was a wonderful thing that we defeated Nazism, the unlooked-for consequence was that we delivered Eastern Europe into 40 years of slavery under communism. So perhaps it's a time when we can more broadly look at what happened in Europe throughout the 20th century and think about our role in that and how we react to it now. So
you see this as an opportunity to remind ourselves for educational purposes as much as anything else?
Yes.
But national pride, you feel, is part of that as well, you think?
I think it is. You know, we have to recognise that we did an extraordinary thing in standing totally alone against occupied Europe. Don't forget that Germany at this point was in control of the whole of Europe, bar, of course, Portugal, which was neutral, and Spain, which Franco managed to keep them out. Otherwise, the Nazis were in control. And we, the little island off the west coast of Europe, managed for a year and a half to stand against this and to essentially keep Europe from becoming a fully fascistic continent. We should be very happy about that.
But isn't it funny, though, because at the moment, with so many sort of social justice activists talking about Nazism and fascism and Antifa and the rise of those sorts of movements, you would think that this, in particular, I mean, this was the death of the Reich, right? So this is surely the moment that they should be celebrating, and yet those same people, I think, are very mistrustful of anything that they perceive to be overly jingoistic, say.
Well, they'll still think that it has connotations of empire and colonialism, I suppose, because we were at the time the British Empire.
Yes.
But that's just such a non-argument, really, isn't it? Come on. The real empire, the empire we defeated, was the Nazi empire that was trying to wipe out the Jews, would have continued and wiped out the Slavic people of Eastern Europe. This was not something that we could ever come to any accommodation with. And I would ask those people who say we shouldn't celebrate VE Day, what would you celebrate? I know, what would you rather have happened at that time?
So what do you make of this, though? I mean, there have been a number of cases recently where prominent, even historians, have said that they feel that Winston Churchill was a racist figure who ought to be cancelled. You know, there was even a conference at Cambridge, I think, with Priyamvada Gopal talking about this idea and talking about his involvement with the Bengal famine, for instance, and saying any kind of celebratory event relating to Churchill is problematic. Do you have much truck with that?
Not really, no. I mean, Dr. Gopal can't really be taken as a disinterested observer of this. She is a highly partial academic who has an animus against, it seems, a great many historical figures, purely because they happen to be white. Now, I would suggest that that's perhaps racist.
She would, I'm sure, say it wasn't just because they were white, though.
No, she wouldn't, but a lot of what she's written on Twitter, as far as I have seen, of course, one must be a little careful with this, has, for me, tinges of racism about it.
But it's not just, I mean, that's your opinion, but it's not just her. Of course, there are many other people. There have been attempts at vandalism of the statue of Churchill in London, that kind of thing.
But look, this is just, frankly, this is just aggravators trying to get a rise, isn't it? It's not really serious historical commentary to go and paint a mohawk on Churchill. It's actually rather amusing. I'm sure that he himself, would have said, you know, all power to you for having the freedom of speech and action to do this. And why is that? Because we didn't let the Nazis win the Second World War.
Yes.
You know, so even though they may now decry him, even though they may say he was a racist, and Churchill did have some views which were entirely typical of a man who was born in the latter half of the 19th century. Yes. They're not the views of someone who was born in 2002.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
There's a century and a quarter separating these people.
You know.
Well, of course, you know, but context is far too difficult a thing for the woke mind to grasp.
Do you think people are losing an appetite for these kind of street celebrations? There have been some celebrations today and that kind of thing. But do you think that kind of thing is just... I mean, if you compare to the actual VE Day, I mean, I think it was 1 million-odd people in central London. Yeah. I believe Queen Elizabeth, the young Queen Elizabeth, mingled with the crowd. And
Princess Elizabeth, Princess Margaret went into the crowds and in front of the palace, and it was...
Yeah, they weren't separated. They were
among them. Well, of course, we're not going to continue celebrating it forever. We don't anymore celebrate Trafalgar Day. We don't anymore commemorate the Battle of Agincourt. We don't anymore think of the relief of Mafeking, all of which were at times through history celebrated. There was even a verb, to Mafeking, meaning to have a big party to celebrate this. And I think as we go on, and as that generation dies off, because there are, when I was a child, the First World War generation was dying, and now there are very few who actually fought in the Second War. You'd have to be well over 90 now to have fought there. I think it will become more of an aspect of commemoration and of thought about our place in the world than it will a celebration. Although, we really should still celebrate the fact that we stopped one of the most murderous tyrannies that the world has ever known.
Yeah, that's not trivial.
It's not the sort of thing that happens every generation. It's an extraordinary thing we managed to do, along, of course, with the help of the Americans, and then later on with Russian involvement. And that's perhaps the aspect that's most uncomfortable for us to think about, that without the Allies, an alliance between Russia and us, we would probably not have been able to stop the war quite so quickly. But by giving Russia that power, then, as I say, we handed over all of Eastern Europe to 45 years of oppression and tyranny.
Do you feel that a sense of history, and particularly the history of our country, is important in terms of a national identity?
Well, of course it is. You can't have any concept of what it means to be English, to be British, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, without a knowledge of that history, how you came to be.
But the reason I say that is because there are so many people are quite keen to either revise what our history was or to eliminate certain physical remnants of it, I suppose.
History is subject to constant revision. It should be. You can't be intellectually lazy and say that there is one fixed history. And in fact, by constantly thinking about re-evaluating our role in history, and by going back to the documents of history and reading those with the light of new evidence, which is what we should do, but I fear too few people actually do. Instead of going to a document and asking, what does this show us? Instead of thinking about an event and asking, what does this tell us? They go with a pre-existing thesis that they then try and prove through specious use of documents and events. But I think you have to understand your history to understand, even if you disagree with it, even if you dislike it immensely, even if you think that the British Empire was a totally merciless, rapacious, dreadful mercantile system that should never have existed, which I don't, but a lot of people do, you should still understand it in order to know how we got here and who we are.